Hi, this is Alan Amsis, and I'm one of the 3 instructors for the research course that you're probably taking if you're watching this video. I'm here to talk to you about interviews and interviewing. And I guess one of the first things I need to mention is that technically interviewing and interviews aren't really a methodology. They're more of a data source. But you can use them so consistently to gather data and to analyze a question or explore a question that they can approximate a research methodology. And I want to begin, before I even talk about interviewing, with just a quote that I found really inspiring. Right now, like many of you, I'm in the middle of this long pandemic isolation, and I'm doing a lot of binge watching of television shows. And I was watching the show last week called The Morning Show about interviewers on television. And there was a great quote that I wrote down because I thought it really summarized what interviews and interviewing can be about. And the quote is this: "When I see someone who has a story to tell, I try to create a space for them to tell it." And I think that just so elegantly and beautifully summarizes the point of an interview. You want to get whoever you're working with to tell you a story, to tell you their story. Now, their story is mediated by your research, your inquiry, your values, your subjectivity, your questioning. Don't ever think that interviews are just about them. Interviews are about you and them. It's a dialogue, it's a dance, it's a collaboration. So now I want to tell you a little bit about my relationship to interviewing, which frankly is really, I think, my favorite way to collect data. And I think that's because it's so intimate. It's really personal and interactive, and no matter how much you prepare, you always have to prepare for the unexpected. So I want to talk a little bit about interviewing in general and my relationship to it. And the first thing I suppose I want to tell you is about my dissertation, which I did a bunch of years ago. I loved doing my dissertation, but it was overwhelmingly interview-driven. My basic question was, I was working with teens who were in a residential therapeutic community school for emotional problems, and the students I was working with in particular were all in drug and alcohol recovery. They were all students whose lives had crashed because of alcohol and drug use. And I wanted to talk to them about what schools needed to be and what teachers needed to do in order to create a better school experience for them. I worked with 9 students, and I did 4 interviews with each. I had originally intended 3, but there was just a need for an additional interview. And that's because I got so much good information from my first interview and my first question. Like, my first question ended up being a 40-minute conversation. So I had to expand. I also did group interviews. I did 3 group interviews with all 9 students, and I did faculty interviews, 4 faculty members from their school. And ultimately, I ended up with well over 1,000 pages of transcripts, which I had to read multiple times. Luckily, it was my data. But the most important thing I think I can tell you about that experience is that one of my students, who later grew up and became a lawyer, was really smart. You know how every once in a while as a teacher, even though you know a lot more content than people in the room, you run into a student who you suspect is smarter than you on some level? Well, that was this student. In the process of doing an interview with him, he asked me a very simple question, which is, what is it you really want to know? And I know it seems like a simple thing. You should know that about yourself if you're doing research. But I had to really think, how do I essentialize this right now for him? How do I express what it is I really want to know? And his response was, well, that's what you should ask us about. And I know it seems simple, but there's a whole lot of things you learn while you're doing them. So I want to move on now just to talk a little bit about interviews and interviewing. If you're going to do interviews for a question that is important to you, you of course have to decide who you're going to interview how many interviews you need to do, how long the interviews should be. Really, there are all those kind of nuts and bolts consideration. But probably the most important consideration comes down to something called formal or informal, structured or unstructured interview. And the difference is probably fairly apparent. But the structured interview, the formal interview, is one where you have a list of questions that you ask every single member, and you don't really deviate from it. The content becomes more important than the context, and that's fine. There are a lot of research projects where that's really important. The thing to also remember is that everything you do, all of your data collection, no matter if it's interviews or anything else, is really driven by your question. What does the research question need? What does the inquiry demand? Where does your curiosity go? More likely, however, you will do the informal or less structured kind of interview. And what that means is that you may not end up asking everybody the exact same questions, or you may not spend the same amount of time on each question. I think the most important thing about that to realize is that we tend, as teachers, we tend to be overachievers. I think it is really important to limit the number of questions you want to ask in an interview, especially if you're doing an informal, unstructured interview where a clipboard should not be in evidence. Okay, maybe an index card, just so you remember your questions. But you have to think of the interview as more conversational, more open-ended, more exploratory. So really no more than 4 or maybe 5 questions. And that's for about an hour-long interview. As I've already said, when I was doing the interviews for my dissertation, my first interview, I think I had 4 questions, and I only got through 1. And that question, just so you know, I'm working again with teens who were in a lot of trouble. My simple first question was, tell me how you got here. And that opened the floodgates. I mean, I got life stories in such detail that I never expected, and it was all good. I certainly didn't have the need to tell any one of those students, all right, that's enough about that, tell me more about this. So the thing to know is that you really have, with interviews, the opportunity for in-depth information that is highly personal. And the other important thing, among many, of course, to remember is that it's never just about them. Don't ever think that you have control, quote, over any of this and that you are asking them questions and they open up to you. It is a two-way street. It is about them and you. It is about the questions you ask. It is about the way you ask them. It is about your stake in those questions. It's not unusual, and you should probably expect that sometimes your participants will ask you questions like, why do you want to know this? Or what was your experience with this? Or, why is this important? What are you going to do with this? And you should be prepared to have authentic answers to those questions, because your participants have a right to know that. And even if you're surprised by it, don't assume their curiosity is less than yours. So again, remember that a good interview is going to be interactive, and that also means that it's going to be layered. There'll be different levels at which you can access information. You will have to decide how deep or not you want to go. Again, you'll be driven by your curiosity and the clock. Remember that they're also complex and maybe even contradictory. People's lives very seldom make a literal kind of sense. People's lives, especially if you're working with students or other teachers who have complex stories to tell, there are always going to be things that don't evenly match up like a Jenga tower, and that everything is contextualized. Every story they tell you connects to people and places and things and emotions and events and thoughts in their lives, and you have to decide how many facets of this multifaceted diamond you want to get. What you're trying to get, of course, is the inside experience. You're trying to get what your research question looks like from somebody else's life. And it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of relaxation. Just go into it thinking that you're having a conversation with somebody you can learn from. And two very important tips that I learned early on. There are two phrases you should always think of. One is, tell me more. If you get to a point where you don't know what to do next, tell me more is often a good prompt for somebody to do exactly that. And the second tip I would give is, can you give me an example? It's always good to ask people to go a little deeper with their own experience. So what you're doing, of course, is you're looking for depth over breadth. But you also have to think very practically about how you're going to capture this information. Are you going to record? Are you going to have a tape recorder or your phone? Are you going to do voice capturing? Are you going to do videoing? If you don't do any of that, do you just take notes? Or do you take notes after? These are decisions you have to make because each one will affect the data that you have. For my dissertation, I did audio tapes and then had to transcribe, which took hours and hours and hours, and ultimately I had to pay somebody professional to do it because I just didn't have enough time in my life to do it. But then once you have your interviews, your notes, your recordings, whatever you have, you really have to analyze and transcribe it, and that's where your subjectivity comes in. You construct the process at every step by every decision. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that there's a lot of help out there. You can go online and you can Google interviews and interviewing and formal interviews, and you can find books like this one that are all about interviewing. Or you can go right to your textbook, one of the textbooks we've assigned for this course, and go to chapter 6 on data collection tools. And I suggest you do some of that, but some of it, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, is learn as you go. So I guess the only thing I want to leave you with is that I want you to reflect back on what my students said to me. What is it you really want to know? You'd think that's a simple thing, but sometimes that takes work. And I wish you the best, and I hope you enjoy getting to know whoever it is you interview and getting to know yourself. Thank you.